Sadness. Becky, forgive me. This telecast is dedicated to youth. Now, there are many ways of treating the subject of youth, just as there are many ways of treating the subject of elephants. For example, if a German wrote about elephants, he probably would write a book entitled The Elephant and Its Philosophical Significance in 3 volumes with footnotes. The Soviet would write on the elephant and the war against imperialism. An American would write a book entitled The Elephant and Its Byproducts. And the French would write a paper-covered booklet entitled The Elephant and His Loves. So we have to choose one particular way of talking about youth, and here we begin with the lighter side. But it will develop into something much more important and serious, and this has to do with 2 different characteristics of youth. Certainly, one of the characteristics of youth is vitality, and the other is the emergence of personality. First of all, vitality. That manifests itself in physical enthusiasm, even intellectual enthusiasm. Did you ever notice how much emotion, for example, youth puts into arguments? Sometimes it's to make up for a want of logic and a want of knowledge, but that difficulty does not belong just to youth alone. I know of someone in my profession, really and truly. His sermon was found on the pulpit Monday morning by the janitor, and he had written on the side of a typewritten sermon, "Argument weak, shout like the deuce." So in addition to enthusiasm, there's also that which is so popularly associated with them called sex. This particular time, the girl no longer is interested in playing games. She now curls up with a romance. She begins to dream. She hears of the marriage of someone else. She projects herself into that marriage. And the boy begins to be conscious, too, of his maleness and the sense of his own incompleteness. He feels that he has to shave. He has a choice of buying the light Gillette for light beards, the medium Gillette for medium beards, and the heavy Gillette for heavy beards. He buys the heavy one. And then, in addition to this, there is, of course, the love of movement. Speed, not particular interest in where they are going, but certainly they are on their way. And the like to fracture time. We got in at 4 o'clock this morning. We had our breakfast in the diner out in the country. And music, well, there are music. Music, I think, appeals to 4 different parts of the human anatomy. For example, there's capital music that appeals to the head, which might be the music of Bach. Then there's the music, cordial music, that appeals to the heart, such as that of Chrysler. And then there's the music that might be called visceral. And then finally there's pedal music, moves the feet. Well, youth is principally interested in the pedal and visceral music, only later on it gets up to the heart and to the head. Well, in addition to these expressions of vitality, there is also the emergence of personality. The youth now begins to feel that he's no longer part of a herd and part of a family. Incidentally, youth very often at this age shows his worst side at home and his best side away from home. His worst side at home because he has to fight for the emergence of his personality in order to convince his parents that he's no longer a baby. Begins to call the father the old man. The mother, she says she no longer can understand her daughter. And then in addition to that, there's much daydreaming. Scripture says that the young men dream dreams, the old men see visions. The young look forward, the old look backwards. Laudator temporis acti, said Horace of the old. That which is past is always the best. But this looking forward to youth is personality, life's work, vocation. It's good and it's right. But of course, youth must remember that youth is the morning, and age is the evening of life. Those who have had the evening have already had the morning, but those who have had the morning had not yet had the evening. You think your parents are behind the times. Remember, that's what your parents told their parents, and someday somebody's going to tell you you're behind the times. Now, these are two different aspects of youth, but it is possible now to regulate youth in different ways. For example, one can regulate youth and life on the basis of what might be called the pleasure principle, as Freud called it. Or one can, taking this other aspect of youth, regulate life on the basis of character. Those who develop their lives solely on the basis of pleasure say, the only reason we're here is to have a good time. Get as much fun out of life as you possibly can. Those who start with this principle are concerned with values, with goals, with destinies, and why we're living. This is the answer to the question, what then? The young man is told, he's asked, what are you going to be? I'm going to be a doctor. What then? I'm going to begin to practice. What then? I'm going to marry. What then? I'm going to raise a family. What then? I'm going to make money and retire at 78. What then? It's that last what then we have to start with. Now, are these two different principles contradictory? No. But suppose, however, one starts with the pleasure principle. What happens? The development of character loses its urgency. If youth starts with the idea that we are here in this world solely to have a good time, there is danger that the giving away to the emotions, to sentiments, the lower part of our being, will begin to cloud our reason. We lose the capacity to think clearly because we are influenced by the way we live. A robber has to defend his philosophy of robbery, his robberies. Murder is crime. And after a while, there begins to be an adjustment to our behavior. And the result is that there may develop skepticism and doubt. Youth may even become atheistic. These are not intellectual positions, and let no educators believe that they are. They are just simply moral positions. They result from behavior. And then, too, one of the dangers of this pleasure principle is the pleasures are going to decrease as time goes on. Suppose I had the habit of, when I was talking to you, of just doing that. Well, you would say after the first 178 broadcasts, isn't that a strange habit that he has? And then if I were to impress you with the next 178 telecasts, I would have to do something like this. And then when we got into 400, I would have to do like this. So we lose the capacity for enjoyment as time goes on. And then we begin to suffer ennui and boredom and feel that life is not worth living. That's one of the grave dangers of starting with the pleasure principle. And it's rather difficult when youth starts with that to ever rationalize them and reason them away from it, because they justify giving way to their emotions. I believe that one of the best approaches that has been developed was by a professor of philosophy at the University of Cambridge, C.S. Lewis. He wrote a book that went through 25 editions in 5 years called Screwtape Letters. Read it. It's a marvelous book. It's a series of correspondence or letters that were exchanged between an old uncle devil in hell, whose name is Screwtape, Screwtape, and his younger nephew devil on earth, whose name is Wormwood. Wormwood is working on the soul of a young man. He's trying to win him over through the diabolical ways of living. And in this correspondence, the wiser old devil in hell counsels Wormwood as to how he is approached to win over this youth. Every now and then there enters into the correspondence a warning from Screwtape about the enemy, and to beware of the tactics of the enemy. The enemy, of course, is God. As a result, in this work, you get a great deal of spiritual advice upside down, because it's always the devil that's telling you what to do, and you're surprised when you read the book as how often you follow the devil's advice. For example, at the very beginning of the book, Screwtape gets after Wormwood. He says, "Wormwood, you're a fool. You are trying to convince this youth that materialism is right and true. You are even attempting to prove that materialism is true." Screwtape says, "Wormwood, never do that. Remember that proof belongs to the enemy. Remember that it is the enemy who speaks of a thing being true. When you deal with youth, never, never argue about true and false. All that you must do when you talk to youth is get him to ask, is it modern? Is it progressive? Make him fearful that it's reactionary, or maybe it's medieval, and he will steer away from the idea, but never speak of truth." Then he says, get the youth to read cheap poets and fifth-rate novelists. And then you'll grow up with the idea that all kinds of repression are wrong, that marriage was never meant to be one and enduring. And finally, Wormwood's not doing too well with the young man. And eventually he gets on the subject of sex. And old Screwtape said, "Wormwood," he said, "we change styles of sex. Centuries go on." He said a few centuries ago, he said, "we created the mode, the particular type of woman that was desirable was the statuesque, aristocratic type. Now," Screwtape says, "we've left the age of waltz. We are now in the age of jazz. And the woman now whom we idolize is the woman who very closely resembles a boy in looks. She's very thin. One of the great advantages of this is we make her fearful of growing old. And then she's also the type that cannot bear children. That helps us very much." And finally, old Screwtape gives the last counsel, and he says, "Cultivate noise." He said, "There is not an inch of infernal space, there is not a moment of infernal time that is not filled with noise. We have to have noise in order to drown out all of our dismal worries and anxieties and fears." And he said, on earth they must have noise too, noise to drown out the melodies and the silences of heaven. And we do not yet have enough noise on earth. I am almost in despair. It's a great spiritual book for youth. It will warn them of the danger of the primacy of the pleasure principle. Now suppose you start with the other principle. Suppose you start with the character principle. Then you begin with discovering the purpose of life. There has never been a system of education, and there will never be a system of education equal to that, which takes a child 4 or 5 or 6 years of age and turns him into an Aristotle or a Plato and makes him answer at the very beginning of life the question, why were you made? And there are millions of children in this world who are answering that question with, I was made to be happy. And the way to be happy is to know truth and to love goodness and to seek a life that is enduring and eternal. In other words, I am made for God in the fullness of His revelation and all that is. When a youth starts with that plan of life, then everything else fits into place. The biological, the economic, the social, and pleasure. Then the youth begins to understand these instincts. Certainly a youth has great passions and emotions, and they are right, and they are good. And let no one ever say that they are evil, because they are divinely implanted. Almighty God has put into every youth in the world two great hungers. One, a hunger for food, and the other, the hunger for a mate. And God implanted these impulses and hungers simply because, first, individual life had to be preserved by eating, and secondly, social life had to be preserved, humanity, by birth and by generation. And Almighty God, in order to ensure the preservation of individual life and the preservation of social life, associated great and intense pleasures with both of these impulses, in order to be sure that the ends of man would be achieved. Let no one therefore ever tell you, and we say these instincts are wrong. They are not wrong. They are not wrong any more than the instinct for play is wrong, or the instinct for pleasure, or the instinct for happiness. What is wrong is to say, well, we have these impulses, and we must follow our nature, must we not? Yes, we must follow our nature. But our nature is not the nature of a pig. Pig will use certain instincts according to season and laws implanted by nature. But we are to use these instincts according to reason and according to will and according to the final purpose of life. When youth understands that, then he will not fall prey to a very false doctrine which is upsetting youth and upsetting the world, namely believing that man is to be understood in terms of sex. He is not. Sex is to be understood in terms of man. You might just as well say to you, my voice is to be understood in terms of the larynx. There's something else in my voice and the words that come out than the larynx. And so sex is associated with love and is related to the whole personality. When youth understands this, the final goal of living, then he takes these God-given pleasures and enjoys them in the way that God intended. Then his life is normal. Then he's not suffering from ennui and suffering from boredom, beginning to feel that life is something at which we may sneer. If youth today is protesting against the older generation, it's not because the youth is wrong, it's because the older generation has not given him that culture and those principles which youth needs and which youth believes that it should have. Why should we always, when we think of youth, immediately begin talking about juvenile delinquency? Why is it that we always pick the worst that youth shows instead of the best? When we study art, do we look at the crudest manifestations of art? Or when we study music, the babblings of a child, do we not always look to the best? Why is it that immediately juvenile delinquency comes to our mind when we speak of youth, if it is not because crime makes better news than virtue? And why does crime make better news than virtue? Because a civilization that has a sense of guilt, even though it be unconscious, likes to read about how wicked other people are. It makes them feel more innocent. Why not look to the best that is in youth? What is the best? I will tell you what's the best in youth. And this is the reason of hope for youth. Every year, there are tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of youths who give themselves completely and totally to God. I wonder if there's anything more beautiful in all this world than a young girl full of charm, full of loveliness, in the very bloom and blossom, springtime of life, taking all of this and consecrating it to the origin and source of all beauty, God Himself. Should we despair of youth when we know that there are tens of thousands of young men full of enthusiasm, full of life, full of passion, full of wild furies that take all of these things and tame them and discipline them and then bring them to the very source of life and love, which is God Himself in one great passionless passion and wild tranquility? Why, that's the source of goodness that there is in this world. There are indeed many in this world who give their old bones to God. Of course, God takes their old bones, but it's much more beautiful to think of the young giving their life to God. And after all, they are the ones that are always young, because how do we know when anyone is young? By closeness to the source of life. But there's another source of life than parents, namely God. And therefore, the closer we get to God, the younger we become. The more we live in union with Him, the more fresh we become, until we reach our birthday, which is the day that we are united with love. No wonder our Lord said that no old people enter the kingdom of heaven unless you become as children.
People of all faiths recognize Bishop Fulton J. Sheen as one of the greatest communicators of the 20th century. He was born in El Paso, Illinois, in May of 1896. As a young boy, he knew he wanted to be a priest. He served as an altar boy at St. Mary's Cathedral in Peoria, Illinois. At St. Viator College, his education and debating skills taught him the skills he used throughout his life. His unique ability at being natural and at ease in front of any audience was noted early in his ministry. He was ordained in 1919 and went on to become one of the best-known and greatly loved
family. And so the little child prayed and said, "Dear Lord, my brother has the mumps. Her sister fell off the bicycle and broke her leg. And my older brother has pneumonia. And Daddy lost his job. So, dear God, please take care of yourself, because if anything happens to you, we'll all be in the soup." We have received so many letters from people who have had greater sufferings than this little girl. We decided tonight to talk on the subject of suffering. First, on some of the paradoxes of suffering. Secondly, on two ways of meeting pain or suffering. And finally, how to accept it. First of all, the paradoxes. Have you noticed that in our contemporary civilization, there happens to be a coincidence, first of all, of great material prosperity, and at the same time, a tremendous amount of inner and mental discontent? First of all, we do have material prosperity, The per capita income of the United States is around $1,750. In China is $26 a year. But along with that, there's an inner unhappiness. 51% of the hospital beds of the United States are occupied by mental patients. We ought not to have this tragic sense of life with so much prosperity. Why is it? Certainly is not because we're prosperous. It can only be because, to a great extent, we are assuming that all we need to be happy is some external prosperity. In other words, we've made our philosophy a philosophy of having, rather than a philosophy of being. And the reason there is this inner discontent and unhappiness is because man is trying to put the infinite into the finite. This is the mathematical symbol of the infinite. This is the symbol of the finite. And what we're trying to do with our soul and our heart that was made for the infinite of life and truth and love, we are attempting to pull this infinite down into our finite structure with all of its material environment. It simply cannot be done. Rather, what we should do to be happy in the midst of prosperity is to take this finite nature of ours and plunge it into the infinite. As Hans Werfel said, this line of the human and the finite and reason must be crossed somehow or other. And Werfel, continuing, says, it is crossed above by faith, and it is crossed below by insanity. That is the first peculiar paradox of modern suffering. Now there's a second. And the second has to do with pleasure. Have you ever noticed that we have a greater capacity for pain than we have for pleasure? For example, our pleasures are not always very enduring. For one thing, a pleasure can reach a point where it will give us pain. It can turn into pain. For example, tickling. And then also, have you noticed, too, that pleasures sometimes will go up like this, and then there will be a sudden drop in them. And finally, in order to get identically the same reaction, one must very much increase the stimulus. So we're not getting here, out of this life, all of the pleasure and happiness that we possibly can. But pain, it seems, could very quickly reach an end, and yet somehow it reaches that end that we anticipated, and we still bear it. We go to a dentist, and we feel that if he drills 5 minutes more and goes 6 feet deeper, I just can't stand it. We stand it all right. And then he continues to bore, and we know he's going to hit oil. We stand it. There are many people listening to me in sick beds of suffering who felt that they should have exhausted themselves months or years ago, but they still can go on suffering. Now, why is this? Why do we have a greater capacity for pain than for pleasure? I think because it was intended by God that all pain here should end. That's why we seem to exhaust Him. Because there will come another world when tears will be wiped away. The sorrows of this life are not worthy to be compared with the joys that are to come. But with pleasure and joy, particularly, is not intended to be exhausted here. That comes elsewhere. That happiness is being saved for heaven. And if people understood that, perhaps they would be, well, less mentally disturbed, less inclined to go to the psychiatrist, because they've all got skeletons in their closet. They make no bones about it. That brings us to the double reaction to pain. There are two possible ways of enduring pain. As Stevenson expressed two ways of looking out of prison bars. Two men looked out through prison bars. The one saw mud, the other stars. And in the midst of agony and pain and suffering, one reaction of pain can be rebellion. The other reaction of pain can be resignation. Why this difference? The difference is due to the fact that this person sees no purpose in pain. And when there's no purpose seen, no final destiny, when pain is just as opaque as a curtain, then it's rather natural for the soul to revolt against it. When one can see a purpose in it, see it as a means, see it transparent, and as opening onto something else, then there can be resignation. These two attitudes toward pain were perfectly exemplified on a day when two thieves and revolutionists were put to death. They were crucified on either side of our divine Lord. Both of these revolutionists suffered exactly the same torture. They had identically the same background. When they each felt the impress of the nail in their hands, when the crucifixion began, they blasphemed. And then when finally they had mounted their crosses, they heard the one on the central cross speak. It was a peculiar word he spoke. Generally, when men die, they either protest their innocence, or if they have any spark of justice in their souls, they ask for forgiveness. But here, for the first time in the history of the world, the Son of God on the central cross was saying, Father, forgive them. They know not what they do. When the thief on the left heard this cry, he suspected that there on that central cross was power. And so he asked the one on the central cross if he had power to take him down. That to him was the sign of omnipotence, to stop that pain and that suffering. Why should he be there? Why did he ask to be taken down? Not to be made better, but simply to go on with the dirty business of thieving. But the other thief, when he heard that prayer from the central cross, he immediately began to see a relationship between his sufferings and his guilt. His background as a blackguard, a revolutionist, and a racketeer. And some sparks from the central cross ignited some inflammable material in his soul. And in the belfry of his conscience, the bell began to toll. He spoke to his brother thief, and he said, Fear ye not, fear ye not. We suffer the just reward of our crimes. But this man has done no wrong. Then he uttered a prayer. And turning to the divine Savior on the central cross, he said, "Remember me. Remember me when thou shalt come into thy kingdom." Kingdom? This one who apparently was a fellow criminal, this thief, looked at a crown of thorns and saw there a royal diadem. The nail was to him a scepter of power and authority. His crucifixion was his installation, his blood was his royal purple. And they asked only to be remembered. And there came back this day thou shalt be with me in paradise. Now, it was the foundation of democracy, the worth of a single soul. Thou shalt be with me. I always wonder why he said in paradise. Be with him is paradise. And the thief died a thief, for he stole paradise. And paradise can be stolen again. And from these two reactions, we see the one that is to be chosen. The two ways in which pain can be used. Pain can be used, first of all, in expiation. That is to say, for our own failings and sins. Secondly, in reparation, for the failings and the sins of others. First of all, expiation. I can remember when I was a boy, about 8 or 9 years of age, my brother and I were playing a ball in the backyard, and we threw a ball accidentally through the neighbor's window. And Mother heard it, and she called us in. And she sent us to our piggy bank. And she made us take the money out and go over to the man next door and give him the money for the broken window. And also ask him to forgive us. Now, why shouldn't we just ask to be forgiven? Because we broke a window. People think that when they do anything wrong, all they have to do is be forgiven. Oh no, we disturb an equilibrium, an order. That order often has to be redressed. For example, if I stole your watch, if I stole the watch of one of these operators here, if I could get close enough to this cameraman and steal his watch here, and then I would say to him, "I'm awfully sorry, I stole your watch. Will you forgive me?" He says, "Yes, I forgive you." But he says, "Give me back my watch." Well, so it is if we have sins. And who in the name of God hasn't? Well, we can ask the good Lord to take the pains, come to us in expiation, and redress, and atonement for all the wrong that we have done. We put down our foot, for example, 3 times in illegitimate, sinful pleasure, and to get back there to do right again, we've got to put our foot down in pain and be like little doggies with our tail in back of us. And then when we reach this point, then only can we begin to do good. That's one way pain can be used. And the second way in which it can be used is in reparation. And here we offer it up for others, not just for ourselves. How often, for example, in the physical order, doctors will graft skin. If we burn our face, from our back to our face, to restore our pristine elegance. If a person is suffering from anemia, doctors will transfuse blood from an anemic member of society to the healthy member of society to the anemic person in order to cure the person of that condition. Now, if it's possible to transfuse blood, don't you think it's possible to transfuse prayer? If it's possible to graft skin, it's not possible also to graft some reparation, some sacrifices. We live in a world in which we do not grow the sheep, for example, though we wear woolen clothes. Others help us. So it's possible to take our sorrows, our disappointments, and the jealousies and the hatreds of others and turn them all back again as the thief at the right did, in order that someone else might be saved. That's reparation. Why should we offer up our sufferings in expiation or reparation? Simply because we love. Love will not kill pain, but love will diminish it. A mother sits up with her sick child all night long. For it's not agony, it's love. There are not any lovers in the world, I mean real, true lovers, who would not willingly take on the pains and the agony of others, if they possibly could. Love in the face of sorrow does not seek isolation. It wants to take on that pain as its own. And why should not love in the face of sin and evil want to do the same thing? The great tragedy of our world is that most people have no one to love. And since there's no one to love, they never think of the love of God. Their life is tragic indeed. Oh, the tragedy of the world is not so much suffering as what we miss when we do suffer. Think of all of the sick in hospitals with aching brows who might in some way sanctify that pain by correlating it to a crown of thorns. And all the wounded hands that might sacramentalize that agony did they but correlate it in some way with hands that were riven with steel. To all the aching hearts of the world, with all of their worries and anxieties and fears, they would only not allow that pain to go to waste, but offer it up in union with someone whose heart was open to take in all the hearts of the world. Why should we fly from that love? I slipped his fingers. I escaped his feet. I ran in heaps. For him I feared to meet. One day I passed him, fettered on a tree. He turned his head and looked and beckoned me. Neither by speed nor strength could he prevail. Each hand and foot was pinioned by a nail. He could not run, nor clasp me if he tried. But with his eyes, he bade me reach aside. For pity's sake, thought I, I'll set you free. Take this cross, said he, and follow me. This yoke is easy, this burden light, not hard nor grievous, if you wear it tight. And so did I follow him who could not move. An uncaught captive in the hands of love.
Thank you.